Just to sort of start the conversation, how do you see this impacting or affecting our relationship?
I'm seeing more challenges come up.
And especially amongst couples where there's numerous pressures in roles and responsibilities going on. So we're seeing that with a lot of people who have children who are working from home and trying to manage childcare now on their own, might have older parents that they're also trying to look after.
Hey, welcome back to the Wits Podcast. My name is Greg Wits, and I'm here with two amazing human beings. We have Dr. Nina Mafrici and Dr. Michele Foster, founders of the Toronto and Psychology Wellness Group. Today, we are going to talk about relationships. It's a hot topic right now, and relationships are stressed. We are stressed as individuals, and it's impacting the way we parent, and it's impacting the way we are showing up as spouses and partners. You know, right now, a lot of people are living in fear, and fear makes us frantic. And obviously, fear also brings on things like anxiety. And, you know, just to sort of start the conversation, how do you see this impacting or affecting our relationship? So why don't I start with Michele? Michele, why don't you kick us off?
I think there's a ton of different outcomes that could happen, right? So we've got people who are in these relationships that might have had some struggles before, and when they are together and really stuck, it can amplify and get quite a bit bigger, right? And that can lead to things like divorce, breakdown of relationships. We've also been hearing reports of increases in abuse as well in relationships. But then you also have the flip side where people, maybe they haven't had a lot of time for each other, and now all of a sudden they're home. They have all the time in the world, and they can spend more time really developing and nurturing their relationships. And so some relationships are actually doing quite well. So I think it can go one of two ways, but I'm seeing more challenges come up for sure in our work with clients. Yeah.
Yeah, I think relationships are really difficult in normal circumstances, and it's even more difficult now. You know, Nina, tell us what are you seeing out there? I mean, do you agree with Michele? Do you think there's more sort of suffering and challenged, or?
I think just because of the nature of what we do, we tend to get the challenges. So we tend to get the people that are coming to us with the issues. And I think if we look at sort of the threat system that we speak about a lot in psychology, this sort of behavior that we engage in when we perceive threat as human beings, it's the fight, flight, or freeze response. So we're seeing that happening in couples right now, which is the fight, sort of the conflict, verbal conflict that's happening when tensions are high, or the flight, I'm just going to avoid because the conflict seems too high, too threatening for me to deal with in the moment, or the freeze, right? Don't know what to do, and so I just stall. So we're seeing a lot of that happening right now between couples, and especially amongst couples where there's numerous pressures in roles and responsibilities going on. So we're seeing that with a lot of people who have children who are working from home and trying to manage childcare now on their own, might have older parents that they're also trying to look after. And that sort of overload in roles and responsibilities is hard to navigate between couples.
I think, as mentioned earlier, it's hard to navigate on in normal circumstances. And
Exactly.
I love the fact that you talk about the fight, flight, or freeze. I talk a lot about this in some of the work that I do. And, I think we know that whether it's an emotional threat or whether it's a real threat, that amygdala operates in the exact same sort of way. And it's unconscious, and it's primitive, and it's instinctive. And, I think it doesn't allow us to show up in an effective way. So, when you talk to clients or patients, what advice or what tips or what things do you help them do to manage some of that fight or flight or freeze syndrome?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to acknowledge when it's happening. So when you've gotten into either a conflict or something is frustrating you in your partner, is to be able to manage that head on with the individual. So acknowledging that there is a disruption here, that there's a conflict that's brewing. Sometimes it means taking space first apart from one another to collect your thoughts, and also acknowledging when there's a need to actually make a repair. And we talk about this idea of repair. We talk a lot about in DBT and dialectical behavior therapy, when there's been potentially a rupture in the relationship and we need to come together to sort of work on it. So avoidance is one of the worst things that we can do, because basically what it does is shove everything underneath the surface, and it just continues to build, and then eventually it blows up, and that's when we're seeing major conflicts happening.
Yeah.
But then there's also things like the fighting response. So when there's verbal and sometimes, unfortunately, physical aggression that's actually happening right now when people are feeling unsafe in their relationships.
Hmm. Well, that's pretty severe. I mean, we are hearing spikes in things like child abuse and domestic violence, and even addiction and substance abuse. So, what are some of the other patterns we should be looking out for within our partners if we are stuck at home? And I mean, are there things we should be looking out for to pay attention to?
I would agree with what Nina said in relation to that, right? Like knowing whether your partner is one who fights or flights or freezes, and kind of seeing if that's happening a little bit more. And it can take on a variety of presentations, just like you're talking about, right? So more substance abuse for sure, more lashing out, higher reactivity, irritability. Sometimes it's even little things like you might hear your partner be like, "Oh, can you stop slurping your soup?" Or like, "Oh, you're breathing so loud," right? Like those types of things, or like,
Yeah.
"Put on actual pants." Like, or just like these like sassy things that we sometimes say to one another, like
Yeah.
increases in that. I mean, and we joke about it, right? Because we're all probably guilty of it, but in reality, an increase in that is suggestive of the fact that there might be some resentment, some frustration. And so it is important to respond to. So at a minimum level, I mean, I think that's sort of where it starts. And then it grows into some of the more serious and severe things that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
I also think, like, with each other, like I said, knowing how your partner typically responds and then being able to acknowledge that and speak to it, right? And how you respond too. So saying, okay, guys, like I need to step back. I'm not doing okay right now. I'm feeling this urge to really avoid you. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go for a couple of minutes, take a
Mhm.
walk, and then I'm going to come back and we can talk about it. I think that's a really good way to address it so that it doesn't get too big.
Oh, I was just going to say that I also think too, it's important to recognize that this is a time of tremendous anxiety for the vast majority of us. And so there's going to be naturally frustrations, right? Everyone's vulnerabilities are a little bit higher, and we might not be able to tolerate things that normally we're able to tolerate in our partners. And that comes back to, and we can talk about that later, but a little bit more about carving out physical space with one another when you're at home together all of the time in order to sort of reduce that vulnerability.
Yeah, it's hard though. It's really hard right now. I mean, we're all in it. Both of you are parents. I'm a parent. As much as we have these plans to take some time for ourselves and to do this, it just doesn't seem like there is. So where does that line kick in of being selfish? There's a right amount to be selfish so you can show up in a healthy manner for your relationship. So what is that line?
It's really tough to say, and it's very individual for couples. And I think it starts with that open communication. Something that we've been talking to all of our clients, whether they're in relationships or not, in sort of romantic relationships or not, is speaking to the people that you're living with around what are your needs right now. So what is everyone's needs in this home environment? When do I need physical space? Some people, for instance, introverts, need more time by themselves, right? That's their recharging time. Extroverts, on the other hand, like to be around a lot of people. So they may be craving more of that physical contact and attention. So
Mhm.
it's really important to have that open dialogue to determine, okay, what does this person need? What do I need? And being able to kind of respect one another and come to a middle path around what is going to be agreeable and
Mhm.
doable for the relationship.
Yeah. What I hear you saying, a lot of the success in how we navigate these upcoming times is how we communicate with our relationship. And, I think I heard, and I'll paraphrase, the theme I'm getting from both of you is the importance of engaging in a dialogue early, seeking understanding, sharing position, expressing emotion, expressing ideas. And for a lot of people, they've really just been forced into this. Have you ever heard of the concept of isolation versus fusing, or isolating versus fusing? So when we emotionally fight with our loved ones, depending on who we are as a personality, determines how we are able to emotionally resolve. So what you described is more of the introverted person. They like to isolate. They need to take some time to withdraw, to be by themselves, et cetera, et cetera. To think about things. The fuser is the opposite, which is in order to emotionally resolve the fight or the argument, we need to come together and everything needs to be, warm and connected and loving and compassionate. And, in a lot of cases, what you end up in couples is one person prefers the isolator or the isolating and one person prefers fusing. And that creates, in some cases, more conflict. So, what advice should we give to the fusers, the ones that need to resolve in the moments? I mean, is it as simple as saying just give them space?
I think it comes back to that communication and also respecting individual needs and differences. So ideally, if you can have this kind of conversation early on with your partner and sort of say, we're in close quarters right now. We're bound to run into conflict if we haven't already, or based on the history that we've had that we've run into this conflict. I have this need to come to you and to resolve things really quickly. I'm understanding that you need to have some space. So can we at least agree on, a predetermined time that after you've had that space, maybe you're going to come to me when you're ready and we can have that dialogue and sort of communicate with one another. But it does come from this mutually, not only communication, but understanding, right? So respecting individual differences.
I want to come back to a point that you brought up earlier. Maybe Michelle, you could kick us off on this one.
Yeah.
But anxiety and fear. For the audience, a lot of people will blend those two words. They'll correlate fear and anxiety to be the same thing. And I think one of the simple ways I've described it in the past is, fear can bring on or induce that anxiety in some cases. So,
Yep.
When it comes down to fears, are there some best practices or things that we can do as individuals to help manage our fears, to help manage some of those perceptions, in order that we don't end up in this place of anxiety, where in some cases it's too late? I mean, when you have some of your patients talking to you about ways to manage and navigate fear, what do you share with them? Or, what advice do you give?
It's such a good question. So for both of them, for fear and anxiety, we often talk about how emotions have an action urge with them, right? So every emotion has an urge that goes with it. And with fear or anxiety, the urge that goes with it is actually to flee, generally, right? To run away from what's scaring you the most. The challenge becomes that the more that we do this over time, the fear grows, right? And then the anxiety starts to come in a way that we often call it like anticipatory anxiety, right? So you think about something that you're scared of happening and you just get afraid at the thought of it, right? And then it builds and builds and builds. And the challenge becomes the more we avoid something, the harder it actually is for us to approach it. And the more that anxiety really builds over time. And so the way that we actually suggest that people deal with it, now this might not be the most popular answer because it's anxiety provoking just to even think about it, but really it's actually to approach what we're afraid of, right? And so that's why if you listen to what Nina and I are talking about, we're often saying, okay, like you got to communicate, you got to talk about it, right? Because that really helps you address it head on. And a lot of the time, the stuff that we're really afraid of, we're actually, when we approach it, we realize that it's not as big as we thought it would be. And so approaching what we're afraid of, provided, again, it's safe to do so. I mean, there will always be exceptions to this. That's generally like the rule of thumb for managing our anxiety. And in this situation, it's really no different.
Just bringing it up early. Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about my 3-year-old that didn't want to go down to the basement this weekend because of the anxiety, the fear, right? They were like, the basement scares me. And, this is the first time I thought, wow, there's an example of the anticipation.
Exactly.
And of course, we walked downstairs, and once we were there, it was okay. And that's the exposure. I mean, we see this happen with Navy SEALs. How do these elite individuals, how are they able to handle the stressful environments that they expose to? And it's due to the exposure that they've trained and put themselves through. So maybe there's a little bit of advice for relationships out there for some exposure therapy.
For sure. And just to add to that too, Greg, I mean, the other thing related to avoidance is that we do it because it feels good, right? So as soon as we avoid something, the anxiety drops right away. So it's like, of course I'm going to avoid going to the basement. Of course I'm going to avoid talking to you about this, because if we can just sit here and watch Law and Order further, my favorite show, then obviously we don't have to talk about it and I feel better, except that over time it just grows. So that's the challenge. Yeah.
You just said something and it just something clicked in my head. Not only is it an emotional thing that we get, but we're rewarded for avoiding, in the sense that our partner or the other person also avoids. And then next thing you know, it becomes okay to not bring these things up. Do you see this happening a lot? I mean, is this a major issue with relationships?
Yeah.
One of the biggest issues that couples come into couples therapy for is breakdowns in communication, right? And this occurs in relation to finances, which we know is one of the biggest stressors when it comes to couples and the breakdown in relationships. Moving, right? Changing jobs, anything, introduction of a child. So all of these things for a lot of individuals lead to that breakdown in communication, because as you were saying, it's highly rewarding, highly reinforcing to avoid. It makes us feel better, right? I don't have to think about it until the next blow up occurs, and then I can sort of superficially patch it back up and then, stuff it under again. And that's why we actually see things like divorces happening years after marriage or even much later in life, right? Because there's been a lot of this superficial patching, but not that sort of let's get down and to the meat of it, to talking about, what has caused this breakdown in the relationship 20 years ago, that we've kind of been ignoring.
Just going to add, that's also why we often see couples when they do get in arguments, they bring up like all these random things that happened years before, and then the other partner's like, well, what the hell are you holding on to that for? Like, that was ages ago, right? But if you're not communicating, then it just builds and builds and builds, and then it really blows. And you've got this awkward pattern that really doesn't help your relationship heal, like any wound, right? And it starts to fester, and so you really need that communication.
We call it in my world backpacking, which is we all have this emotional backpack that we carry. And it's like a little bit of a checks and balances sort of exercise. That every time someone does something, we put that in the backpack and we think, I'm just going to save that one for later and save that. And eventually the backpack gets pretty heavy and we need to release it. And that's when sort of it all comes out. And it usually comes out in the worst moments, or it's brought on by external factors like this pandemic we're living in.
Yeah.
So we've been talking about couples and partners, and I just also want to make sure that we touch upon a little bit of parenting as well, because the way we are navigating our relationships with our children is also really important. Maybe not call it the younger kids, but some of the older kids, teenagers, young adults that we're stuck at home with. What are some things that we can be doing to deepen our relationships with our kids?
I think it's a great question. I mean, one of the things that I would suggest is trying to find time to check in, right? And really validate for our kids what the experiences that they're going through. So listening to what they're saying emotionally, like what's going on for them, and then reflecting that back and validating, even sharing how we share some of the same thoughts and feelings, and reflecting and expanding upon that, I think is key. And also being lenient with one another, right? So sharing that it's okay to have a little more screen time, or to just relax a little bit. Maybe you're not going to get every single item of your schoolwork done. That's fine once in a while, right? Just getting where one another is coming from and being open and honest, I think is key for letting those relationships develop, and taking space, which I'm sure Nina will talk a bit about more too.
Yeah. I also think too, one of the issues that's coming out the strongest among parents right now is sort of this feeling of inadequacy. So, compared to my best friend or my sister or the person on Instagram, I'm failing at this parenting job. I'm failing at being a teacher and, a mother and a psychologist, all at once. And I think it comes down to judgments and those social comparisons that give rise to these kinds of judgments, that's where I'm seeing a lot of the mental health challenges, giving rise to anxiety and depression amongst parents, which is I'm not living up to this expectation that I have. And I think, we need to be realistic. We need to have more candid, open, and honest conversations with other parents where, someday it might look that I'm having a picture perfect day on Instagram, but the reality is there's a lot of tears. There's a lot more screen time than, I'm letting on. My kids are eating a lot more boxed mac and cheese, and that's okay, right? I think what I keep stressing to clients is that we're in a crisis, and I think we need to stop also pretending that it's not a crisis. This is a time when our whole world has been turned upside down, and we really need to validate that for ourselves and also for others.
Yeah, give us some permission to not be on all the time. I think, you brought up social media. We've been living in the social media world for a long time. And I think if one thing this pandemic has done is force people to be way more authentic and raw and real. And, we are seeing, we might cut it out, but if we did cut it out, we're in the midst of this, and Nina's kid ran into the podcast right now. Technically it's an imperfect world, and that's okay, because it is creating more connection. This is, I see, happening more and more and more and more in our effort to be raw, or not in our effort, in our and our inability to put it on anymore because we are working at home, because we are so exposed with our families. I've seen some people connect in ways they've never connected. So do you see that happening as well, which is we're deepening our external relationships in ways we never have before? And is that in some cases a way to replace my relationship at home? In other words, I'm stressed at home with my significant other and my kids, and I get, to use your words earlier, Nina, I get rewarded in other ways, and therefore I'm now finding other ways to connect with people. So are we seeing that? Are we seeing people connect in different ways and relationships deepen because of this?
I think so. I mean, I would say, reflecting in my own life too, like I think about one of my closest friends, we're not really phone people, we don't talk on the phone, but now nobody's going out, everybody's lonely. So we're spending more time having these like girls' nights where we connect over Zoom and we chat. And there's something really great about that, right? So nurturing relationships in a different way than we usually would. And even I think about like, my husband with his work, something he's been doing is like dressing up kind of funny for some of his Zoom calls, right? And like just trying to entertain people. And I think it allows you to see a different side of the people that you work with or that you normally have in your life, which just brings a bit of levity, I think, to the situation that's really needed. And absolutely that would filter through to the relationships we have at home, right? If you feel like you're able to get a little bit of separation and connect to that real self that's inside that your friends see and your work colleagues see, it helps big time. Yeah.
Sort of brings up for me this idea of kind of the people who are struggling are really fighting with the reality of the situation. So we talk a lot in our work with people, when we fight with pain, when we resist pain, so the pain of what we're experiencing right now, we create suffering for ourselves, right? So we create that unnecessary sort of amount of distress. When we can accept the pain or the reality of the situation, and accepting doesn't mean that we like or agree with it, it actually opens ourselves up to a little bit more mental freedom, right? So showing our authentic self, showing that life isn't really perfect behind the scenes. There's a lot of people that we work with who struggle with perfectionism that are trying to maintain such structure and order to their days, and it's failing miserably and they're feeling more distressed about it. So being able to communicate that to other people and show one's authentic self is a great way of trying to accept the situation, even if we don't like it.
So I heard you talking a little bit about boundaries there, which is the importance of setting some limits or setting some boundaries, not just personally, but professionally as well. So is that a really important thing to be doing right now, which is setting some of those boundaries with people?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're seeing that across the board. I think for everybody, we need to create various boundaries, right? So there's physical boundaries that we're creating, right? With social distancing, we can't get very close to people. There's emotional boundaries, right? So how much am I disclosing to certain people about the things that are going on in my life? There's boundaries related to the time and space we're devoting to others in our household, right? So cultivating time where I can be alone and also time when I can be with the rest of the family or with my partner and enjoy that time with one another. When there's an imbalance in those boundaries or where those boundaries feel off in terms of what we need, then things like resentment can build, frustration can build, irritation, anxiety, and that's sort of, a perfect kind of melting pot for conflict.
Exactly. And I think one of the things to add to that too is this idea that right now a lot of our boundaries have to change. So they're not the same as they were before. And the difficulty that can arise from that is that when you change the rules of the game, people tend to react, right? So right now, if you have to give more or less of yourself than you usually would to your partner, and you just change that without talking about it, you can expect that there will be some arguments. And same thing with kids, right? I think that's huge now is they see you working from home and they're like, well, you're home. Like, can't we hang out? And you're like, no. And then they freak out, right? And so you have to really say, this is what my new boundary is going to be. This is the time period that I expect it to last. And if you communicate that, things will be so much smoother. Again, communication, right? It's kind of annoying to say the same thing, but it's key.
But in life, it's the simplest things that make the biggest difference. And again, it's not rocket science to go to your significant other, right? Technically the person you love, and say, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm feeling, here's what I need, here's what I'm asking for, and here's what I'm willing to do for that. And have that conversation often, like far and few between, like have that conversation.
I don't like to use the word normalcy during a time like this, because I think for a lot of people, they sort of feel this is anything but normal. And so let's not pretend. But I think what's missing for a lot of people is the chance to have fun and enjoy time with one another. I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. One is that, for a lot of us, we're working from home. And so we're trying to navigate all those roles and responsibilities. We tend to lose sight of, as time goes on, sort of cultivating that sense of connectedness and fun and enjoyment in things that are not work or not school time with our kids. So at the beginning, I think everyone was all rearing and ready to go. Well, I'm going to create these great meals and we're going to do all these board game nights and things like that. And that became old very soon, right? People were like, I've had enough of this and I can't do it anymore. And so now it's like, no, what can we actually do together that's really enjoyable? And maybe that's shifted from before this time, right? It's going to be a different kind of enjoyable reality for us all. But having fun, being able to connect with one another, I think is really important. So it might be the Zoom calls with your friends, or like the, games nights that you have online, or it might be going on a really long hike with your partner and kids. And maybe hiking wasn't something you even enjoyed before all of this happened, right?
Right. And so the idea of other things that will promote our relationship include like having fun with stuff. I was talking to a couple last week and they were telling me that they've been doing these theme nights where, they think about their favorite items from a restaurant that they would typically go to, and they create that menu at home and they dress up as if they're going out there. And another couple was telling me that they did like a Grease movie theme night where they dressed up as Sandy and Danny, and then they made like fair food and played all the music. And,
Cool.
it's not necessarily, we certainly are seeing like dangerous things that are popping up in relationships like we spoke about earlier, but a lot of it too has to do with not nurturing our relationships in an appropriate and balanced way. And I think if we can do that, we can actually protect against some of those dangers that are popping up a little bit more.
That was the best thing that you said, which is like the importance of nurturing our relationships, and not just because we're in this crisis pandemic situation, stress. Like, this is just advice that we've heard from, in some cases, our grandparents, which is don't go to sleep angry, and forgive, and don't forget to date, and don't forget to fall in love again. And it's all this real, again, simple exercises that we need to practice, which in some cases was going to be my last question for today, but I'll loop it in now, which are, what are some of the other practices we can be taking on in our relationships, not with our friends, with our children, with our families?
I like the idea of practicing gratitude. And I mean, I think as cliche as that might sound, there is something really beneficial at a time like this in finding something you're grateful for about each and every one of your relationships. And that doesn't devalue all the things that you're frustrated with. So in DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, we talk a lot about dialectics. So this idea that two seemingly opposing things can be true at the same time. So the idea that I can be really frustrated at my partner right now, and I can be super grateful that they brought me lunch to my work desk, right? So there are these things that we can kind of capture that are things we're especially grateful or appreciative of in all of our relationships actually right now.
I agree with that fully. Yeah. I would probably add something around vulnerability, right? I think now is as good of a time as any, if not better, to really be open with people in our lives. I've had clients say to me, I finally sat down and spoke to someone in my family about how I've been feeling because my mood is just really declined, and they had such a positive experience because of that. And I think we can nurture that in our families, our friendships, with our partners, right? To just experiment with being a bit more open, because it allows the depths of our relationship to really expand. And I think that's what a lot of people would benefit from. And it allows you to give and receive support too.
In some regards, this whole situation might have just, put us all in a place to practice and work a little hard at our relationships, and hopefully we come out of this with our relationship stronger. So let's go to the other side. So I'm hearing this a lot. It's actually affecting me personally, not me personally, but I've got someone in my life that's going through a divorce right now, which is, how do you go through a divorce when you're isolated together? Are you seeing this in some of your practice as well?
We're certainly seeing dissolution of relationships happening. And I think one of the hardest parts of this is around the physical distancing. And sort of if you've been in isolation with somebody and that, one of those parties or both of those parties don't have another place to go to, it can be really, really challenging because you're trying to cohabitate while your relationship is dissolving. So I think, again, here, bringing it back to boundaries and really laying it out there and talking about, what are appropriate, respectful boundaries for both of you during this time, taking time apart from each other, planning times when you can talk about things, reaching out for support, right? So there's lots of therapists right now that are continuously engaging in couples therapy. And now is when we're seeing those couples therapy requests really flooding in because people are at each other's throats at home and they need an unbiased third party to help them navigate some of these challenges. And there's no shame in that, right? There's no shame in needing somebody on the outside to help you communicate with one another when you have been experiencing such great conflict.
It's so funny. We decreased our rates for couples therapy slightly because of this. And somebody reached out to us and they were like, "Is this a joke? Like, do you know that I'm actually like everybody's suffering, and so you're doing it like?" Is it a joke? And I was like, well, no, no, no. Like, we're doing it because people need this service more. And we're seeing that in the work that we're doing and the calls that we're receiving. So it's definitely happening. And boundaries, like Nina said, is a great way to deal with it. I'm also curious too. I'd be really curious to see after the fact whether like Airbnb rentals from people already in the city are increasing, because I'm hearing a ton of that too. Like they just, rent a place, go for a few days and then come back. I'm very curious about that.
I would love to find out those stats as well. In fact, I'm sure there'll be, this might be somewhat generational, but some of the audience might remember the movie called War of the Roses, which was this, it was Michael Douglas and someone else. Anyway, they went through a massive divorce. And one of the things he did was he taped down the center of the house. And he said, everything on this side of the house is yours and everything that's on this side of the house is mine. But then they ran into some issues with some common areas like the kitchen and stuff. But, as you were talking, I was just thinking about some green tape across the house being like, that's your side, this is my side, here's the boundary, right? But hey, if that's what it's going to take to make sure you're healthy.
There are some great solutions. Yeah. I mean, people are trying to make do with what they can. And I think, you kind of alluded to this earlier, but I think this time really what it's doing is it's putting the magnifying glass on our relationships, right? We're suddenly seeing, some of the positive things, but a lot of the negative things, a lot of the things that we haven't had an opportunity to really go into further. And it's bringing things to the surface. And hopefully, as you said, through this time, we're going to come out of it and have maybe a little bit more respect for actually nurturing those relationships.
Nina, you spoke a little bit about something called tunnel vision. Do you want to expand upon that?
Yeah, so tunnel vision is this idea that really a limited perspective taking. We see it all the time in people with anxiety, depression, high emotional distress, which is basically where we look at the world as if we have blinders on and we're only looking at the things that basically confirm our thoughts and beliefs about ourselves, about other people, the world around us. So if we go into, our day thinking, well, my husband, after having a really tough day with our partner and thinking my husband is the absolute worst and I'm so frustrated, we're basically looking for mistakes in our partner. We're going throughout the day looking for those errors to sort of blame them and fuel our frustration more. And what we're missing out on are all of the things that are actually disconfirming that evidence. So the things that maybe we might be grateful for, or maybe the things that that partner is doing to support us or the family in some way. So that tunnel vision is really detrimental to our mental health. It's detrimental to our relationships. And in therapy, we work a lot with people on trying to take those blinders down and specifically look for that evidence that disconfirms that belief that we have that this is true or that is true.
We call it reframing, which is our capacity to look at a situation differently. So, the advice sometimes I give, or in our practice we give, which is, let's reframe as simple as reframing the question, the statement into a question, which is instead of coming with the statement of they're doing this, ask a question of, could I look at it differently? Or is there a reason behind that? So is it as simple as that, in the moments, in order to combat tunnel vision, someone can simply start to use some reframing questions?
Yeah, I think it is about reframing. It's about taking that broader perspective. And sometimes that comes from developing questions like, what are the pieces of information that I'm actually missing here? Or what am I not paying attention to? Reframing something we use all the time when it comes to judgment. So judgments are, again, something in which we have the tunnel vision on. I'm the worst mother today. Well, that's not a very helpful judgment, right? It gives rise to feelings of guilt and shame, unjustifiably, right? So reframing it into a fact instead. So saying, today was a really hard day for me, and leaving it at that, right? We can see how that brings down the level of emotion as opposed to blaming ourselves.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I often add to that too is the idea of trying to find the opposite. So, does the opposite exist anywhere, right? So, for example, if I think my partner's being a jerk today, well, is there anything that my partner did that was actually really kind and really helpful? And then what I actually suggest for people to do is to even write it down, right? To spend some time really reflecting on the opposite of what it is that you're feeling. And again, coming back to that concept of dialectics, where these two things, they can both have truth to them for sure, right? Maybe my partner did something that was really upsetting or unkind or unfair, but there are also plenty of things on the flip side too. And so trying to find that balance. And if this is kind of where you tend to hang out, focusing on the negative, then really sort of honing it by spending some time writing and fleshing it out will help build that over time. Takes time, but it does work.
There's a disconnect between our expectation and the reality. It could be this romantic idea at the beginning of spending all this time with my partner and cultivating the relationship, and then it gets down to it and you're fed up by the end of the day. So it does start with creating boundaries. I think that's the first point, which we talked about earlier, and creating physical and conversational boundaries. So there might be times when you just don't want to get into it, and that's okay. You don't have to have deep conversations about your relationship throughout the day. Set aside a time during the week to do it. And then there's supporting one another in these stressful times. So understandably, we're all coming to this situation with a range of emotions, a lot of anxiety, a lot of frustration. It's really important that we respond to our partners with a sense of validation. So we might not totally understand what our partner is going through. We might not accept it even. And we can still create some type of connectedness with them by showing genuine interest in the fact that we care. And that just includes stopping what we're doing, putting the phone down, and listening to them when they're talking about the things that they're going through. That's the basic premise of validation, is just having that open dialogue and being able to listen to that individual without judgment. Yeah.
In fact, it's a good practice to do with our kids.
Absolutely. Right. It's one of the things that I think us as parents struggle with the most with our children, right? We tend to inadvertently invalidate them. When they're hurt, we don't want to see them hurt. So we say, don't cry, but that's blatantly invalidating their feelings, right? They might throw a huge tantrum and we don't like the behavior. That's okay. We cannot like the behavior. We cannot validate the behavior. We can still validate their emotion. It seems like you're really distressed right now. What can we do to help support you in kind of coming down from that emotion?
In fact, I see this happen all the time. You'll look at one of the partners or one of the parents, validate the emotion in the child through after the bad behavior. They don't accept the bad behavior, but they validate the emotion. And then as they finish, they look at their significant other and they're like, "Fuck you, blah 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 blah." Right? You shouldn't. And all we're doing is in some cases, we got to remind ourselves to be conscious in the moment to say, "I just validated this child. I need to validate the other child in order to get them to the place of what we call that mature sort of thinking of adults." Yeah, very funny, man. Very cool.
Exactly. Greg, also, you say something about intimacy before, and that exact kind of behavior that you're describing, where, you nurture the child and then you turn to your partner and you're like, that's going to kill any sort of emotional, physical intimacy that you want to build, especially during this time. And I think we've been talking with a lot of clients too about challenges related to like sexuality, and that kind of physical intimacy as well is certainly coming up. So I know a lot of people are saying to me, I'm home now all day with my kids. I've got my kids crawling all over me. Like, I do not want anybody else touching me, coming close to me, just go away. So that's definitely coming up a little more, and relates to boundaries in terms of how we're going to deal with it, right? So making sure that you and your partner are maybe trading off if you can with the kids, so that you can have some time to just not have people all over you. And I think the other piece too that we're seeing right now is people at home, if they can, a lot of people are spending time in their pajamas all day, or like I remember telling Nina before, like my husband was growing this massive beard, and then I was like, I'm done with the beard, like I cannot, it's been a month. And so then he comes and appears and he's got this like porno stash going on. I'm like, no, that's not working for me either. There's just like a whole lot, and I'm not perfect myself, I will own that too, but it's like, certain things like this are coming up for couples. We're seeing a whole lot more of each other in multiple different ways, and that can affect our desire to be intimate with one another, because we already maybe feel like we're getting too much. So those are things that are coming up that I think as partners, we want to be mindful of what is exciting and attractive for our partners, but also make sure that we're taking care of our own needs and just try to balance it out a little bit.
For sure. Maybe socially distance ourselves from our partners a little bit. So when we do see each other, right, there's that interaction. But I heard your point there, which is this isn't time to be lying around all day. Like we have to put the same amounts of effort and energy into our relationships as we are our work. We still have to get up and shower and dress and clean and live. Otherwise, it's bluntly, it's quite unattractive.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges with relationships, is that we tend to put all of our effort into things like work, parenting, even friendships, because we define those as priorities, where we get comfortable in the relationship and we think, well, that person's just always going to be there. Like, I don't have to really worry about it. I need to focus on the things that matter at the end of the day or by the end of the week. And that pattern, when it continues, is what actually leads to that relationship breaking down, when we're not putting in that time and effort, that nurturing into that relationship.
Ladies, this was amazing. Thank you so much for being here. I think what's really cool is coming from two clinical psychologists. The advice that you gave us today was easy to implement things, things like setting boundaries, communicating early, creating awareness, having the conversation over and over and over, recognizing the emotional needs that our significant others have, and not just significant others, but our children and family and friends. And it's been a very deep conversation, and I hope the audience has gotten as much as I have through this. So again, thank you for being here. If you are looking for any mental health support, these two are some of the best. You can find them at Toronto Psychology Wellness Group. We're going to put all the information in the captioning and the details below. We're going to tag both of you in so we could connect with you as well. And ideally, hopefully, we'll get you to come back and talk to us about some other things. So
I would love it.
So thank you both.
This was fun.
Thank you. We had a great time. Thanks, Greg.
It was awesome. We're definitely going to get you back. And for the rest of the audience, don't forget to follow Dr. Nina Mafrici or Dr. Michele Foster or Toronto Psychology Wellness Group. Again, we're going to put all the information below. If you like this video, don't forget to click that like button below. And also don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for being here. We will see you next time. Hey, I'm Greg Witz. Thanks so much for coming and checking out the video. If you like that video, you're going to love the next one. So I'd highly suggest that you click this video over here. And don't forget to subscribe and share.